Hello and welcome to the Bookcast Club, a podcast for readers. I'm Jenny, coming to you from Norwich in the UK, and I'm very pleased to say that I have been joined by Holly on the podcast. Holly came on, oh gosh, when were you on, Holly? It could have been like 3 years ago now.
I think it was October of 2020.
Oh, 2020.
It was so long.
Yeah.
Infamous 2020.
Infamous 2020. You came on, I'm pretty sure, for a spooky kind of episode then, didn't you? I think we were talking Gothic.
Yes, we were talking about Gothic fiction.
Yes.
Yeah.
But where are you, Holly? Because obviously you sound like you might be also from the UK, but you are not, are you?
Yeah, so I grew up in Surrey, but I have been living about 2 hours from Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia for the last nearly 10 years.
Wow.
Next year is 10 years, which is crazy. I can't really believe it's been that long, but yeah.
Which also means I can't believe that we so me and Holly know each other through, I guess, blogs and social media, basically. And yeah. I remember you moving out there, so I can't believe it's nearly 10 years. That is terrifying.
I know, it's crazy. I think I used to read your blog when I was at uni, which I graduated 10 years ago this year, so that's scary, and
mad.
Time just disappears into the abyss.
Yeah, it really, really does. But thank you for coming back on. Me and Holly are going to be chatting. Well, so this is obviously like our Halloween spooky episode, but we've niched down and we are actually going to focus on haunted houses today. I'm really sorry to all listeners about my voice. Robin has started school, so inevitably we've all already had a stinking cold in the first 2 weeks. So you sound better than I did. I'm aware that I'm quite croaky, which isn't that nice to listen to, so I do apologise. First of all, I'm going to get Holly to join in with the old regular format of the pod, and we're going to just chat what we've been reading recently, or currently reading. Have you read anything good lately?
Yeah, so I have actually been ploughing through a book that I'm sure most people, if they are in like the creative Instagram space, know about, called The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. I know a million people have probably talked about this book online over the last few years, but essentially what it is a kind of guide for how to embrace your creativity, get back your creativity if you feel like you've been kind of lacking. And the big thing that kind of goes along with The Artist's Way, the author recommends, is a thing called morning pages, where you essentially get up in the morning and you write 3 pages of just freehand. You don't have like a prompt or anything like that. You just write 3 pages and then you're done. You don't have to look at it again, or you can come back to it a few months later. And she has a whole bunch of different things in the book of like how you can incorporate morning pages into your day, other things that you can do. So one of the things that I really love is called the artist's date. So essentially you just take yourself to coffee shop, park, museum, wherever you kind of want to go on a little like day date with yourself. And so some people I know have done this to actually write their morning pages. So I have a few friends who recommended The Artist's Way to me, and they will get up and take their morning page notebook to a coffee shop, and so they'll kind of combine their artist date with their morning pages. So I've been working through that, it's very interesting. It's quite a brain challenge, especially if you like think about creativity in a particular way, and now you're kind of finding out different things about it and trying to incorporate some of these different practices. So that's what I've been kind of working through the last few months, really. It's like every chapter's not very long, it's maybe about 6 pages, but there's a ton of exercises to do and things that you can try, and so it does take a while if you want to actually like do the process.
I have never read it, and I feel like I definitely should have done. I feel like it's kind of like the Bible of creative writing.
It is. That's a really good way of describing it. I feel like everyone and their mother has read this book, if they're like a writer, photographer, any kind of creative like profession, or if they're just creative like as a side thing. Yeah, I feel like everyone seems to talk about this book. How old is it?
Was it written in the 90s or something like that? Or is it older?
I think so.
That?
I think it's like 20, 30 years old, something like that.
Yeah.
I think the edition that I have is like a re-release, like 25th anniversary one. So I think that's why it had a bit of a resurgence.
And so did she invent? That's probably not the right word, but did she kind of invent morning pages? Because I feel like everybody,
I think so,
that does creative writing probably knows about morning pages. And yeah, it's funny to think that that's where it stemmed from, that book.
Yeah, I'm sure other people did similar things, but I think she was the one that might have coined the term morning pages, and the fact that it's 3 pages and then you stop. You don't do any less or any more.
Ah, okay. I didn't realise that's quite how it works. Like, I knew that it was like free writing.
Yeah.
I love the idea of morning pages. In reality, not a morning person.
Yeah, I try to do it, but because I work for myself, I feel like I can't waste my creative energy on something that isn't work, because I do my best work in the morning. So I kind of am one of those people, I have to get up and get going with work straight after breakfast, because otherwise all of my good energy will go for the day and it will get to 2 o'clock and I've still got a ton of client work to do and it's just never going to get done.
Yeah, all of your creative juice is gone.
Yeah, I'm like an evening pages person rather than a morning pages.
Well, I have just started a very short book called The English Understand War by Helen Dewitt. Now, it's really funny and I've got a feeling this was in a Patreon episode, so I do apologise for anyone that isn't on our Patreon, but Chris mentioned Helen Dewitt and said he was going to read a book by her called The Last Samurai. And we had this whole thing about it not being the Tom Cruise film. But I'd never heard of her before, and I hadn't put two and two together that this was the same author when I picked this book up. It's a really short slip of the thing. It's tiny. It's got this beautiful cover as well. They kind of look like old Penguin books, and it's got I think it's an oil painting, but almost looks like needlework of cake. It's very beautiful. And the book is about a 17-year-old girl, and I think she's unnamed. She's like an unnamed protagonist who was raised in Marrakesh by her French mother and her English father to sort of very lofty standards, and there's lots of references to how one should behave and what one should do, and I've pulled this quote from it. One should cultivate weavers of tweed in the Outer Hebrides but have the cloth made up in London, or one should buy linen in Ireland but have it made up by a Thai seamstress in Paris. And that's the kind of general feel of the book, and it reminded me a lot of, have you ever read Diary of a Provincial Lady by E.M. Delafield?
I haven't. It's one of those ones that I hear people talk about, but I've just never got around to reading it.
It's kind of that same tone, which is a bit weird from a 17-year-old, but I haven't got very far into it, and that's how it's playing out so far. And I just, before we started recording, went to get a proper blurb about it, and lots of people are saying that it's about her parents dying, which I'm assuming isn't a spoiler because it's also in the blurb that I've read, and how she takes on the publishing industry. Now, this story is only 60 odd pages, and I think I'm about 30 pages in, so I don't know how it's going to go from this kind of quite light, fun, upper class, short novella to that by the end in the next 30 pages. But I saw people talk about it on YouTube, and apparently it's brilliant, so I'm assuming it's going to be a really tight, kind of no word is wasted story. Yeah,
just you wait. You'll read the very next page, and that will be when the whole plot suddenly takes a left turn. I'll be like, oh, here it is.
And I won't have needed to spoil it for myself by trying to get a blurb for this podcast. I couldn't remember what it was about. I think I've just been intrigued by the cover, but it's published in the States, so I haven't bought it because I haven't been able to. And I went in a little independent bookshop near me, and it was there on the shelf. So I was like, that's so weird. It wasn't cheap, but for 60 pages, I didn't work out how many pounds it is per page, but hopefully it'll be worth it.
The cover's really interesting. That is very much not what I would have expected for that description.
No, and it's from a series of books, I think. So I think whoever the publisher is has brought out lots of these sort of novellas by, I assume, quite famous American authors, and they're all within a similar kind of vein, like a kind of old-fashioned Penguin book. I think it's Penguin or Puffin, like the children's Puffin books. I think used to have covers like that. So
it does look like a bunch of books I had.
Yes, as a child. Yeah, so that's what I'm currently reading. I'm also very nearly finished with the Paris Hilton memoir, which I think I spoke about on the last episode. I get very confused, Holly, as to which episodes I've talked about what on. But I've nearly finished it, and I've been surprised by how good it is. And
I'm so tempted. I love her. Like, I hated her for so long, but I feel like the last few years I found myself really interested in her, and I feel like there's so much more to her than we ever thought there was, which, I mean, that's not super surprising because they really promoted her as the dumb blonde, but yeah, I'm intrigued, so I might have to pick that up.
I think if you're saying that, I think you'd really, really enjoy this because it is basically that memoir. So it's her not explain. Yeah, it's all those things that you've just said. Like, she isn't who she was portrayed to be, but equally that portrayal of her was very kind of almost controlled from her end. But yeah, she's got quite a troubling past. I think the main chunk of it that I hadn't realised with Paris Hilton is that her parents sent her to like one of these boarding schools for troubled teenagers. Where she suffered quite a lot of not very nice abuse, and obviously there was the like revenge porn video that she was in, which I remember at the time when that came out, it was, you know, the narrative around that was like, oh god, what a slut. So she talks about that as well, and how it, you know, really affected her life and what she subsequently went on to do, and how she was treated by like anybody in the media. And so she talks a lot about not just herself, but a lot of the sort of it girls of the early 2000s who were subject to that sort of abuse really by the media, and how girls like her are put on a pedestal because men think they're beautiful and sexy and all that kind of stuff, and then for the same reasons they're really pulled apart and made examples of. And so it's fascinating. She's so smart. She's like razor sharp.
Yeah, I'm sure. I've seen things of her recently, because didn't she kind of disappeared off the radar for like a good decade, I feel like. I don't really know what she did in the in-between, but yeah, I feel like her and Nicole Richie and kind of that group of people, it was so in the like the OC, the Hills, Laguna Beach kind of era. Yeah. And I feel like just all of those things were just catastrophic for millennial women in general.
Yes. So yeah, no, I think you'd really enjoy it. I think anybody who's
I'm gonna have to get that.
Intrigued by her and that lifestyle. I would say if you are not a big fan of, not that I am, but if you're not a big fan of like influencer culture, then you might not enjoy it, although there's a lot more to it than that. She does kind of talk through how she built her sort of own empire really, and how she became this influencer before the term influencer was even a thing. So it's not a massive chunk of the book, but she definitely talks about it. And she also talks about like all her wild partying days, which I just quite enjoy.
Now, is she the heir to the actual like Hilton hotels, or is that someone else in her family? Because wasn't it her grandfather that started those?
Yeah, I think it was her grandfather.
I never knew if she was the actual like heiress, or if somebody else in the family is the one that's like primed to take over.
I'm not quite sure, you know. She definitely mentions in it that she at one point wanted to open her own hotel, and that was never going to be done through the Hilton franchise or whatever you want to call it. Like, she had to do it off her own back if she was going to do it. So I don't know if she is the heir to the like Hilton hotel empire. I don't know if she's mentioned it, and I get the impression that maybe not. I don't know. I was going to say, I always kind of felt like she wasn't. It was just because she was associated with the name that is why everyone kind of picked up on her. She very much wanted to like build her own career and separate herself from it. Yeah, it's great. I've really enjoyed it. I think it's going to be a solid 4 out of 5 for me. Paris Hilton. That's good. I'm going to have to pick that up. Who would have thought? Who'd have thought? I'm pretty sure that's exactly what I said last time I talked about it. Did that come out this year? Because now I'm just thinking, if it did, I bet that's what Charles Dance reads on Big Fat Quiz of the Year for the celebrity biography. Oh, right. Yeah, no, I think it did. I think it came out at the beginning of this year. I never get those on Big Fat Quiz of the Year, so I think if I read this and that is the one they pick this year, it feels like quite an obvious choice. So maybe I'll actually get that question right this year. This is where we pop a little ad break in to tell you all about the different ways you can support the pod, most of which are totally free. A really effective and easy way of showing your support is by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. There is a link in the show notes that will take you straight to the Apple Podcast page where you can write a review. If you listen on Spotify, you can also very easily give us a star rating. You can also share our posts on social media. We are at Bookcast Club on Instagram and TikTok. You can sign up to our free monthly newsletter on Substack, where we share even more book recommendations, our pick of the new releases, and all the latest podcast news. But the best way for us to find new listeners is by you telling your book-loving friends and family about us. If you want to support the podcast financially, we do have a Patreon account. You could sign up for as little as £2 a month. We offer early access to the podcast, a close friends feed on Instagram, monthly bonus episodes, and our top tier will get you all of the above and personalised book recommendations. We get you to fill in a survey, and then we tailor our book recommendations to your preferences. We will also send you books in the post. There are over 30 bonus episodes you can get instant access to if you sign up as a patron today. We now also offer a 7-day free trial with our bonus tier. The link is in our show notes. But however you choose to show your support, we as always want to say a huge thank you. We appreciate each and every one of our listeners. So let's get into it. We're here to talk about spooky haunted houses. Now, the reason I asked Holly to do this, the reason I chose this particular topic, was because Holly and I are particularly into haunted houses, and Holly especially so. And I'd love you to tell us, Holly, about a very interesting hobby of yours. You actually go and do kind of ghost hunting, don't you?
Yes, I do. So I have dropped a small fortune on ghost hunting equipment in the last year. It's actually embarrassing how much money I've spent on this stuff. But yeah, I've always been into like all things paranormal and a little bit weird and creepy. I used to watch all of... Do you remember when Most Haunted was a thing and we all kind of got into that and we just kind of made fun of it? But to be honest, I only really watched it because I liked seeing where they went, because I'm also a huge history nerd.
Most Haunted.
I just would love that.
Most Haunted was the funniest program. Was this only in the UK, or did they have like a version? I think it might have been. I don't think they ever did a US one, but I went back and rewatched a bunch of them because I think I found them on like Amazon Prime. Oh my god, they're probably so on funny. YouTube. Some of them, like, is it Annette Fielding? Sure. Is she the host? But it was
Yvette Fielding. Yeah,
it was Yvette Fielding, and who was over the top serious, and like random British celebrities. Yes. But it was so obviously like crew members like throwing things onto set, like turning all the lights off and like knocking on the walls and like throwing random nails into shot and all the like celebs scream. It was very so funny.
It was like peak early 2000s, like weird TV. And they had this medium, Derek Okora, who I think he's passed away like in the last few years. But he had like his spirit guide would tell him things and he would like get possessed. And it was just, it was the funnious thing I've ever watched. But, you know, at 11, I was like, this is the best adult TV I could ever see. This is great. And I have very distinct memories of being allowed to stay up when they did live investigations. And my mum would pull out our like original family laptop. So this thing was ancient and had terrible image quality and everything. We would sit and have the laptop on the coffee table with the webcams up. So we would be watching the live show on the TV while we have the webcams up. And my mum was like texting like, oh, I just saw something on screen 3. And it was so funny. So I have so many hilarious memories of that.
So your mum was into it as well?
Yeah, so I don't know if she would have admitted it that publicly, but yeah, she definitely was the one that got me into all of this. And she only really watched Most Haunted just for the kind of the amusement factor, but then we got into, there's a bunch over here in the States, like Ghost Hunters is kind of the big original one that started in the early 2000s. I think that's on UK TV as well now. But yeah, so Ghost Hunters, they kind of spawned off into various different groups. And then there's another show called Kindred Spirits, which actually 2 people from the Ghost Hunters TV show kind of started on their own. And I've actually investigated with them now. So yeah, super, super cool. Lovely people. I love them very much. But yeah, so we went on our first ghost hunt, I think it was almost a year ago. Yeah, it was around October, November of 2022 in Gettysburg. So we live fairly close to Gettysburg and it's all like very Civil War battle focused. And so yeah, the 2 people on the Kindred Spirits TV show, Amy Bruni and Adam Berry, they kind of run Amy's other kind of side company aside from being on TV is called Strange Escapes. And they basically run like these ghost hunting weekends that you can go to all these really cool places. You'll have lectures all day from various people in the paranormal talking about like research they're doing or just anything kind of interesting related to ghosts and weird things in the paranormal. And then you get to investigate a location, a couple of locations, depending on like where they are. So yeah, they came to Gettysburg. I think they do that event every year, but we went for the first time last year, and it was the craziest thing that I have ever done in my life. I was really skeptical kind of going into it, because I thought like, oh, I love all these TV shows, but at the end of the day, it's a TV show. I don't really know how much they're editing things or faking things. And yeah, and then I had 2 like paranormal experiences of my own on that weekend. So I'm like, oh, okay, I think I believe in this. And then I came home and dropped all of my money on the Black Friday sales on all of these like gear websites. And now I have a whole backpack full of stuff.
Amazing. Do you take your own equipment on like organised stints, or do you go and do your own kind of?
So we've done a bit of both. So because we live really close to Gettysburg, my husband and I went out on the battlefield with our gear kind of around Christmas. I think we actually ended up doing that as our Boxing Day walk last year. We were trying to find the foundations of this old house that he knew about. And so we just took a bunch of gear out there. So we have like a digital voice recorder. I've got like an electromagnetic field detector and all kinds of stuff. So we just sat out there in the cold in the middle of this field for like 2 hours.
Oh my God, I'd have come with you on Boxing Day. That sounds amazing.
It was so fun. Yeah, and it's fun because the locations that we investigated in Gettysburg with the group last year, you can actually rent them out yourself. I think it's like $200 for the whole night. So we're trying to find some local people that want to kind of go in on that with us and do some investigating on our own. But yeah, it's super fun. We've met some really cool people doing it. I'm in a Patreon for like a paranormal haunted museum group, and like we all went to the premiere of the group's documentary a few weeks ago, and we've met some really fun people. So yeah, it's a really weird hobby, but it's so fun.
I love it. I'm into it. It's the sort of thing I can imagine getting into.
It is very addictive.
I'm probably into spooky stuff because of my mum, and I've never had any kind of paranormal experience. I always kind of think I wish I would, and then my mum tells me some stuff, I'm like, oh, maybe I wouldn't. But I would love to go on like a haunted house, like investigation type thing. So anyway, ghost hunting aside, we're going to talk about kind of haunted houses, although mine are not necessarily like the typical ghost haunting a house type thing. Actually, I don't know if any of them are, the 3 that I've got. Do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So the first one that I picked is called The Witch of Willow Hall by Hester Fox. So I read this a while ago. I think it was published in 2018. But the reason that I picked this is because I just went to Salem about 2 weeks ago, and this kind of ties in very nicely with that. So the book is set in the early 1800s in Boston, but Lydia, the main character, is supposedly a descendant of someone who was accused during the Salem witch trials. And so really if you know a lot about the Salem witch trials, obviously like the people that were accused were innocent people. They weren't actually involved in any kind of witchcraft, and that's, I think, a point that is often overlooked, and people seem to forget that. I see a lot on TikTok of like, we're the granddaughters of the witches they couldn't burn, and I'm like, sentiment is interesting, but also like these were innocent people, so let's put that to one side though. And so in the book, the person that was accused in the Salem witch trials, who is Lydia's ancestor, actually was a witch, and Lydia has inherited all of these powers that she doesn't really know about until like an incident happens in her childhood, and the family are forced to leave the town and move, I think, to like 2 or 3 towns away. And so they move into a place called Willow Hall, and weird things happen, as they do in many of these like Gothic haunted house books. They move in, strange things begin happening. The interesting thing about this one is that only Lydia can see the things that are happening, so everybody else just doesn't really pay that much attention to what's going on. And kind of content warning for this, there is a sibling incest moment in this book, which I didn't love. And there's also a ton of Gothic tropes. It basically, I feel like the author was like, I'm going to write a Gothic novel, what could I include? And then just added every single Gothic fiction trope known to mankind. So I think I gave this one a 3 out of 5 when I rated it on Goodreads. But yeah, if you're into the kind of Gothic horror type thing, if you like historical fiction, it's a good one. All kinds of weird and interesting things happen. The one major criticism I had of this book is that Lydia is obviously the main character, but then you have the rest of the side characters who are her family, the neighbours, and various other people. There is basically no character development in this book at all. I think the main point that the author was really trying to go with was kind of tying it into the Salem witch trials and then every Gothic trope. So I think they kind of forgot about actual plot in some points, and it is quite predictable in a lot of places. Like there were a few chapters, I remember when I got to about 70% of the way through, I kind of was like, I think I know how this is going to end. And then over the course of the next few chapters, I was like, yes, this is exactly how this is going to end. And it did. So I think, you know, if you want I say nice Gothic read, aside from the sibling incest, I think if you want something that you can kind of pick up and put down fairly easily, it's not too brain taxing. If you just want a spooky October read, this isn't a bad one to go for.
No, that sounds good. And I think, I don't know about anybody else, but I know that although I like spooky Gothic fiction, I also quite like them to be like cozy as well, if that's even really possible.
Yes.
But there's something quite comforting about witchy books and spooky books, I think. Yeah. But then we do like ghost hunting, so
yeah. Well, and I'm one of those people too that I like a bit of predictability sometimes. Like I'm all for a book that takes like a huge left turn about 3/4 of the way through and then it ends completely unexpectedly. But especially at this time of the year when, you know, the weather's a bit terrible and you just want to sit and curl up with a book under a blanket, having a nice like, oh yeah, I can see where this is going. It's kind of nice.
Sometimes a tropey book is exactly what you need.
Exactly.
On this sort of like witch trial vein, when you were talking about that one, I can recommend The Familiars by Stacey Halls. Have you read that one?
Yes, I have read that. I think I read that in COVID.
Yeah, I probably read it about the same time. Probably might have come out around about then, I think. But that's about the Pendle witch trials, which were in the UK. So similar vein, and I did enjoy that one. And I think for a cozy autumnal witchy book, not very happy one, but yeah, cozy in its kind of familiarity. I can't say that word. The Familiars. That's a good one as well.
Yes, I agree.
So my first one, and I don't know that this one is particularly spooky at all. I think it is in parts, but Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth. So I feel like this might have come out in around 2020, 2021 maybe. And it's a big old chunk of a book. I think people will remember it because the book was bright pink and it has a picture of a wasp or a yellow jacket, I think they're called in the States, on the front.
Yes.
This is the story of the Brookhands School for Girls, and it's partly set in 1902 when we get the story of like two students who worship this writer called Mary MacLane, who wrote this scandalous memoir, and it's almost that kind of stan culture of like getting really obsessed with one particular famous person, and they set up a club called the Plain Bad Heroine Society. And they meet a very macabre end, and this isn't a spoiler because it happens like it's the very first bit of the book, where they're attacked by a swarm of yellow jackets, and that is how they are both killed. But I can very vividly remember that school setting. So Brookhands has one; it's a spooky old building that holds a lot of secrets, but the book's also illustrated, so it's got these beautiful kind of Gothic illustrations in. And I can really vividly picture a scene where they are reading this memoir in, not a greenhouse, I don't want to call it conservatory either. What's like a posh conservatory on a mansion type thing? Garden
like a
room. Sunroom, yeah. I can really vividly picture them like hidden behind the plants reading this book. It's then got this narrative that's set in the present day and is narrated from a Hollywood actress's perspective, and she is set to play a lead in a horror film, which is, this is very convoluted, but it is based on a book about the school and about the goings on at the school and the hauntings at the school and the deaths at the school, etc., etc. So she's set to play the lead in that horror film, and so that modern day timeline eventually takes them to the old building because they use it as the set. So that's the kind of general gist of the story. It has a very quirky narrator, so I think I gave this maybe like a 3.5 at the time. However, it's one of those books that I know some people would love. So it's got this very quirky, almost narcissistic narrator, and it's like a 600, 700 page book. So if you could keep going with that for a long time, then you'll enjoy it. It's also got lots of footnotes. Now, I found a lot of them superfluous to the story. It was definitely the style that the author is going for, and I found it a little bit tiresome in the end. But overall, it's a really good, fun story, and it's got LGBTQ plus relationships at like the core of it. So yeah, I enjoyed it. It's a good, fun time. And if you want a meaty book to kind of get stuck into and fly through, because it's very compelling, then yeah, I can highly recommend. I'd say actually it's probably for fans of The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, because the Hollywood side of it is very kind of glamorous and set in like the film industry and has a lot of backstabbing and a lot of goings on, separately to the story set in 1705, which is a lot more of the classic kind of Gothic spooky house. A boarding school setting is not something that I've read before. I'm sure it exists within the genre, but yeah, I enjoyed it. It's a good fun time, so if anybody is up for picking up a slightly macabre book like that, and the book is beautiful. I remember on dotted through on lots of the pages are little illustrations of wasps like all the way through, so yeah, it's a good time.
That's really interesting. I've never really come across a fiction book that has that many footnotes.
Yeah, I feel like I probably have, and it feels like a quirky thing to do. Yeah, I found it tiresome in the end. But actually, I think I probably stopped reading them is what happened, because
that's usually what I do with footnotes.
They're weren't like the typical footnotes that you'd find in like a scientific text or something, or an academic text. They'd be things like, I'm making this up, but she'd probably say something like, oh, so-and-so smoked X brand of cigarettes. And then, like, in the footnote, she'd write, I'm not really sure of this detail. And you'd be like, okay, fine. What a waste of my energy to go and read that footnote. So it's like that all the way through.
Book.
Yeah, I don't care. But so I think it was done for, like, quirky reasons as opposed to adding anything to the story, but it's different.
That's funny.
The other thing that it reminds me of a little bit is the film The Craft, just for that kind of like girls in school getting together and doing slightly sinister things kind of vibes. So yeah, fans of Evelyn Hugo and The Craft might enjoy that one.
I have to say, I went to an all-girls school. It was not a boarding school, but I feel like I really missed out on that particular stereotype of, like, you sneak off and you just conspire at 13 and weird things happen. None of that interesting shenaniganry happened with us. We just had too much homework and complained about it. Exactly. It always reminds me of do you remember St. Trinians when that was a big thing?
Yes. Yeah. That's
what that makes me think of.
Everybody that doesn't go to boarding schools, like, dream scenario of what actually goes on.
Yes. I'm sure that it's nothing like that, I'm sure.
No.
So my next book it's probably one of the most classic haunted house books you could ever read, and it's The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Now, remind me, Jenny, did we read this as part of your Gothic fiction book club? Was this one of the ones we did? I don't remember.
Which makes me think we may have done, and I've only read it the once.
I feel like we read so many books, I don't remember, yeah. And I think they made it into a Netflix show around 2020, 2021. I feel like I vaguely remember that coming out, but I haven't seen it, even though I read it, but for some reason I didn't ever watch the show. But if you are not familiar with the book, it has 4 main characters. Essentially there is like a psychologist doctor. I'm not really sure what he is. Dr. Montague. He is essentially researching the paranormal and the supernatural, and has heard about all these things that happen at Hill House, and invites a group of people over to spend a couple of weeks at Hill House to see if they experience anything. So there's Luke, who is I think he's the heir of the house, but I don't quite remember like how he ended up getting the house, but he's there. And then these 2 women, Eleanor and Theodora, are the only 2 that actually accept the invitation to come and stay at Hill House. So the 4 of them end up living in Hill House. There's also the caretakers, the Dudleys, and they refuse to stay in the house. They'll kind of do bits and pieces around the house during the day, but they will not stay there by themselves or with anyone else. So the house has had a history of violent deaths, suicide, all kinds of things. There's supposedly paranormal and supernatural activity that is happening in the house. Dr. Montague wants to research it and see what's happening to everyone while they're there. And as you can expect, weird things happen. So they see things, they hear all kinds of noises. I remember at one point there's writing just appears on the walls. And yeah, so the book kind of just takes you through all the various weird things that happen. But there's also some very odd tie-ins to the individual characters. So I think Eleanor has a disabled parent, and she is kind of resentful of the fact that she has to look after her disabled parent, and so she kind of sees going to stay at Hill House as an escape from her regular life. But there are other things that potentially tie in with her that aren't really that expected. Like she thinks she develops some kind of like psychic abilities, or it's not very clear whether she had them and just didn't know about them, or if she develops them by being in the house. So as the weird things continue to happen, every individual character starts experiencing very unique experiences. So yeah, it's really interesting. But yeah, I would say if you want a real classic haunted house book, like this is the one to go for. There is something for everyone who loves like Gothic fiction, anything a little bit weird and spooky. I love Shirley Jackson, so yeah, I love Haunting of Hill House. I need to watch the Netflix show at some point and see how it compares.
I need to reread this one because I cannot remember it at all, and it's really funny because I have seen the Netflix series and I still can't remember what happens. My distinct memory of that book is like descriptions of the house. So I remember there being this like spiral staircase in one of the rooms, and then in the Netflix series, like they really nailed what that looked like in my head. And there at one point there's like a room that's locked that they can hear stuff the other side
like
of
weird
happening.
Things happen. Yes.
So yeah, it's not. The problem is, and kudos to me for not mentioning, we have always lived in the castle, and I'm not going to talk about it again because I talk about it all the bloody time on this podcast, but because that's my favourite Shirley Jackson and I've read it quite a lot before I read The Haunting of Hill House, I was a little bit disappointed. That is kind of like my lasting memory, is feeling a little bit disappointed by it, but I think I need to just give it another go because I'm sure I will love it, and it's just kind of different, and I need to give it another chance, I think. So my next book is Whitest Fortune by Helen Oyeyemi. Now, we definitely... Did you read this one? Because we definitely read this in my Gothic fiction book club.
I don't think I did read this one.
This one is, out of all the books I've got, the one with the most malevolent house. Like, the house is actually evil, and that is what the story is about. So it is set in, this house is a B&B in Dorset, I think, or maybe Dover. Would Dover make more sense? I don't know. Our protagonist is brought up in this B&B that's been run by her family, and female members of her family have disappeared, and it's almost as if this house has kind of taken them because she can hear voices in the house. The house is like actually racist and stuff, like it actually, and like xenophobic, and does weird things to the guests. It's one of those books that's really hard to describe. It's the only Helen Oyeyemi book I've read, and I remember at the time thinking, I don't understand everything in this book, and you really kind of have to go with the flow of her writing because it's very unique, and it kind of ebbs and flows, and you just kind of need to go with the fact that you don't understand it. Because I remember when I was trying to read it, trying to like get to the bottom of what she was saying all the time, I can see that would lead to quite a frustrating reading experience. So I don't know if her other books are similar, but I'd say like go with the flow of her writing. It ended up being like this really kind of spooky, unnerving story about this sinister house, and I think it's got a lot to say about kind of black families and black history in the UK actually, and how they're kind of treated by white people. Again, some of this is set on campus as well, so the daughter like leaves to go to university, and it deals a lot with, she suffers with lots of mental health issues, so the whole book kind of deals with these quite difficult topics through the lens of this very strange, macabre, awful house. I wouldn't say it's scary, but it's definitely like unnerving. That's probably the word I'd use.
I have to say, I do really enjoy Gothic fiction and haunted house books that the house itself is really the character. And just generally, not even outside Gothic, but I feel like that's a real Gothic trope, is the personification of the actual building. And I feel like in a lot of cases, like people will dive into that in small doses, but the main hauntedness of it is something in the house. It's not the house itself. So I really like the idea that the actual house is not only personified, but that is a major plot point, that the house itself is doing something.
Yeah, and the whole book is just kind of, it must be her writing style, but the whole book is kind of enchanting and yeah, I've said it, unnerving, and yeah, a good one for this time of year, but probably not for the faint-hearted, because her writing is quite difficult, and like I said, you do need to kind of let go of understanding it all, I think, and let the story wash over you a little bit, which is probably why I'm struggling to like recount what it's about.
So my last one is probably an author that most people are familiar with. I think this is how you pronounce her name, Audrey Niffenegger. She was the author of The Time Traveller's Wife. I think this might be her only kind of ghost story Gothic type book. It's called Her Fearful Symmetry. I think it came out around 2009, 2010, so not that long after The Time Traveller's Wife, but it's set in Highgate Cemetery in London, kind of set in the cemetery. It's the flat in the book overlooks the cemetery, and one thing I found out that was really interesting was that to write this book she did a ton of research, and she actually became a tour guide at Highgate Cemetery for a while because she had learned so much about the cemetery and the surrounding area that she was essentially qualified to become a tour guide. So I thought that was kind of funny. But the basic premise of this book is these two twin sisters inherit this flat that overlooks the cemetery from their aunt who's passed away, and things happen in this flat. They befriend both the upstairs and downstairs neighbours. The downstairs neighbour, I think it's the downstairs neighbour, had been in a relationship with their aunt for several decades, and so they kind of befriend him, and strange things happen. They have a very quirky upstairs neighbour. One of the sisters has I don't think it's a terminal illness. She has some kind of medical problem that has been with her for their entire lives, which I do feel like is a little bit of a trope, like having twins but one of them is very sickly. That seems to be something that comes up quite a lot in Gothic fiction and ghost stories. It's like something always happens to one of the siblings, and it's always some kind of medical problem. So yeah, this is not a spoiler. Essentially, the reason that this is a haunted house is the aunt whose flat this is, she is a ghost in the flat, but she is completely mute and completely invisible. So weird things happen, like she can touch things and move things, but they can't see her, and she can't say anything to them, so they have no idea what's happening. There's like a very strange bit where there's a cat, and she somehow has the cat's soul in her hands, and it temporarily kills the cat, but she's able to put its soul back in and it comes back to life. So that's really when they start trying to figure out like something is clearly happening in this flat. So that happens quite early on, if I remember rightly. But yeah, it's just very odd things happen in this flat, and they don't really know what's going on. There's kind of the dynamic between the twins, then there's the relationship between both the downstairs neighbour and the upstairs neighbour, and there aren't that many characters, if I remember rightly. It does feel a little bit slower slow at times, but on the whole I think it was a pretty good read. It's, if you like the style of The Time Traveller's Wife, she has a very distinct writing style, and this kind of follows a similar pattern, but I think on the whole I think I gave this one a 4 out of 5.
I don't think I've heard of this one before.
I remember, I think I actually might have read this one before I read The Time Traveller's Wife, but I had seen The Time Traveller's Wife kind of in bookshops and people had already been talking about it, so I recognised the author's name, but I definitely was one of those annoying late teen, early 20s people that's like, oh, I'm not going to read things at the peak of their hype, what's wrong with you all? So it was years before I actually read The Time Traveller's Wife, so I think I actually read this one first, but yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I didn't realise she kind of had written anything sort of spooky.
I think this is the only one.
So my final one is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. Again, this came out in 2020. These are all like pandemic books. This is the story of Noemi, who, there seems to be a pattern to these books, but she's like a young socialite, like a glamorous socialite, and she's been invited by her cousin to this mansion basically in the countryside in Mexico called High Place. So I say invited, her cousin has written to her basically asking for her help, and she goes to this mansion, and I'm pretty sure like her cousin appears to either not quite be with it or under the influence of something when she gets there, and she has to deal with the men that also live in this mansion, one of which is the cousin's husband, who you're not quite sure if the issues are that she's in this like abusive relationship that she's trying to escape. I'm pretty sure that Noemi hasn't got to the bottom of what's going on. And then the father in the house is like creepy and very into Noemi and just smarmy and horrible. And the house itself again has this sinister air to it, and stuff's going on, and the longer that she's at the house, she has these dream sequences that get more and more kind of like weird and trippy and hallucinogenic. And I remember those dream sequences being really quite creepy, and this is probably the scariest book on my list, but again, it isn't actually particularly scary. But I remember those dream sequences being quite nightmarish, and her capturing what I imagine quite intense nightmares to be like. This is one of those books that has an absolute batshit crazy twist in it that I wasn't fully on board with, so that's my warning to anybody that reads it. You start off with this quite classic Gothic vibe. It's like that for quite a long way through this book. It's got that very typical mysterious air. You don't really know what's going on. Lots of exploring the house. I vaguely remember a cemetery at one point, like her exploring the cemetery. And I'm not going to say what it ultimately ends up being about or what the twist is, because it's so batshit crazy that I was like, what is happening? But let's just say that her dreams get more and more hallucinogenic, and there's a reason for that, and the reason is within the house. In a way, I maybe should have expected the magical realism to get more intense, but I think because it comes quite left field, you know, Southern American writing can have a lot of magical realism in it, and actually I have struggled with Mexican writers, not just Mexican writers but Southern American writers in the past, because with their magical realism, because it is quite different and elevated to stuff that I feel like British authors would write, or American authors. You do really kind of have to, like, again, like I said with White is for Witch, and you have to go with it, otherwise you're just gonna think it's absolutely like nothing that you can possibly imagine, and it's just off the chain crazy.
Now, am I right in thinking that Mexican Gothic won some fairly big book prizes?
I think so.
I feel like it was talked about for so much.
It was very hyped up, which is probably the reason I read it in the first place, which again doesn't always play into me enjoying something necessarily. But you know, her writing's been compared to Daphne du Maurier and Guillermo del Toro, which I can see a little bit, like some of her imagery and stuff. I can totally see that.
I was just thinking from your description, I'm sure somebody has bought the film rights to this, and that's going to come out in the next few years, because that really feels like the kind of book that could easily be adapted.
I will say that the audiobook I don't think is very good, and that is how I read it. which I think dampened my enjoyment of it. I suspect I would have enjoyed it a lot more if I hadn't listened to it. That the narrator, this is my last in memory of that book, the narrator was so monotone. It was unbelievable. So don't listen to it. Again, good fun. I think I've tried to not go with what I would typically recommend. So I've tried to come up with some different ones today. Well, thank you, Holly. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thank you. This has been fun.
And where can people find you? You're about to restart your podcast, aren't you?
Yes. So our podcast is called That's What We Read. So that will be coming out with a new episode in the next few weeks. Probably when this episode goes live, hopefully we will already have a new episode out. We've been on a 3-year hiatus. So life has finally settled down enough that we could actually start recording again. So yeah, that's coming back out. And then I'm on all the socials, Holly R. Landis. And if you're interested in weird witchy vibes, paranormal things, I also have another Instagram and TikTok, which is Gettysburg Ghost Girl. So I post all about our ghost hunts and anything weird and witchy that we're doing on there.
I will make sure that I link up to all your different social media, and yes, I do like your ghosty account.
I feel like too many other people in my normal life follow me on my main account, and that's kind of my work account as well, and so I thought I'm just going to make a separate one because we do weird things, so not everyone's into that.
I love it. But yes, thank you for coming on, and thank you everybody for listening. There are loads of ways you can get in touch with us with any questions, ideas or feedback. You can email us on the bookcastclub@outlook.com, or you can send us a message on Instagram where we're at Bookcast Club. You can sign up to our newsletter on Substack and chat to us in the comments. We now send out our episodes when they come out, and we send our newsletter out on a not particularly regular basis, which has loads of reviews in, our pick of the new releases, podcast recommendations and updates on the podcast. And finally, if you could check out our Patreon, that would be great. You can get a 7-day free trial of our bonus episode tier, so you can go and listen to all our bonus episodes. You can binge listen to those, and that's fine. You can cancel your free trial at the end. We really don't mind. So yeah, thank you for listening, and we will be back very soon. Bye.